Good evening, and welcome to the November-December 2019 FAA Safety Briefing Live. It's always a pleasure to be with you. I'm Paul Preidecker, and I'm joined by my host, Susan Parson. Hi, Susan.
Hi, nice to see you again, Paul, and have you in Arizona.
Yeah, it doesn't always work out this way, but I'm glad when it does. So since we've last been together, several things have happened. As you know, just on a personal note, I had my very last flight as a Part 121 captain on the airlines about a month ago, and I was happy that you were aboard that flight. And it was quite an honor to wrap up a 20-year career with the airline. And my goal was to make sure that when I landed, I didn't jar anybody's teeth.
And you didn't.
Yes, so it worked out well. Susan, it's always a good time to review the magazine FAA Safety Briefing and describe for us its mission.
Yeah, if you look at the screen right here, it tells you what our basic goals are. We want to raise awareness of FAA resources, which are free, we're funded by your tax money. Explain safety, policy, and regulatory issues, because as the FAA, we can do that in an authoritative way. But the most important thing, to me anyway, because it's near and dear to my heart, and I know to yours as well,
For me
Paul,
as well. Mm-hmm.
Is that we want to use this publication to encourage and inspire continued training, because it's not just a cliche that a good pilot is always training and always learning. There's just never a way to learn enough about aviation.
Well, we're always a work in progress, aren't we?
Indeed we are.
Indeed we are. So this issue that we'll be going through this evening has many opportunities for learning. There's some new concepts that might be part of our discussions this evening. So let's review what we're going to hear about.
Yeah, we'll get right into this issue. Now that's what it looks like where you live right now.
The cover is well placed, because where I live in South Central Wisconsin, we've had our fair share of snow already. I think 10 or 12 inches already. The temperatures have been 8 degrees. We're used to it. We're just not used to it this early, but that's what we have.
Well, we don't have that in Arizona. In fact, around
Indeed.
here, when the temperatures are in the upper 60s, people are in parkas. Mm-hmm. So it's just how it goes. But anyway, the cover is intended to be consistent with both the season for some parts of the country anyway, but also to go along, because you obviously have threats and errors and possibilities for things like that when the weather is not as nice as it might be in other places of the country, like here. So our theme this time is the various, we're looking at threat and error management, crew resource management, single pilot resource management, and listed on the screen here are some of the features that explore those concepts in a little more detail.
Well, it's going to be a good discussion, because it refreshes our resources on things that are fairly well known, but then we also will introduce perhaps a concept that might be not as familiar as CRM and SRM, but we'll have a good time discussing that as well.
Absolutely.
So the first article is the jump seat column from Rick Domingo, and there's several things in there that I noticed, and one is this idea that because we're always learning, and because we're humans, and because we're human pilots, mistakes can be made. And it's important, I think, rather than to, I would say, criticize another pilot for some mistake that's made, or to say, oh, gee, I would never do that. Instead, what we should do is to say, what can I learn from this so that I won't do that myself? And the phrase that I see in here is called never waste a mistake. Yes. I think is a very good one, which I've used in some of the discussions with our captain upgrade classes. And the principle is simple. Mistakes either that we do ourselves or that we learn or read about from others should really be viewed as gifts, and they're gifts of learning, so that we can become better at what we do when we fly and manage aviation. And the other part that came apparent in this discussion in the jump seat column is that TEM, threat and error management, CRM, crew resource management, and SRM, single pilot resource management, all end in management. And that's what we're really talking about, is how do we manage our flight?
Well, exactly. And I think the never waste a mistake, the points that it brings out is the fact that the FAA's compliance program is very much in keeping with never waste a mistake. That the idea is we need to communicate about it. We need to be open about what we do wrong, so that we can make sure that we learn from it and that others learn from it. I know that one of the things I did with Civil Air Patrol when I had the stand eval job in the Virginia wing was if somebody had made a mistake, there used to be an idea that ground them, they have to be, their privileges are taken away for a while. But that's just not nearly as effective as I remember there was a crew that did something that there were people who said, oh, put them on the ground. And I said, well, how about if we have them do a presentation about this mistake?
Absolutely.
To a squadron or several squadrons to do a presentation that will show other people, here's something that you could have done or that you did and you could have done differently.
Absolutely.
So all about managing our mistakes, if you will.
Managing our mistakes, managing risk, and more importantly, learning about some of the mistakes that may come out of those. So
exactly. Well, let's get right into it, because one of the things that Rick talks about is where threat and error management fits in. And gee, this article might be a little familiar to you, so maybe I should let you talk about it.
I'll be glad to. I see that it has my name on it, and I had a good time writing it and working with your staff on this as well. So threat and error management is essentially a concept that started in the mid-1990s as a tool that the airlines would use to anticipate threats or risk and then determine how to mitigate it. And I start this article out by something that's near and dear to all of us, and that is, if I said to you, you have 5 minutes to buy a car, would you make the right decision? And
Probably not.
And I know for me, I would not, because I would have to do lots of research and get some data points and do some comparisons. Mm-hmm. And the point of this is that most of us do not make good decisions under exceptional time pressure. However, as pilots, as the flight is unfolding, we're making decisions all the time. We're making decisions about our route of flight, weather decisions, maintenance issues. Should I go this way or that way in terms of deviating for weather? We are constantly making time pressure decisions. And most of the time, it works out fine. However, in order for it to work out fine, we have to have at least either a knowledge of or an anticipation of what are some of the threats that could come our way. So the article goes into a little bit about what are some of the definitions, and very briefly, I mean, threats are things that are coming at us, like weather, ATC clearances that are complicated. Maybe the aircraft has a part that is not functioning, taxiway closures, NOTAMs. There's a variety of things that are coming at us. And if we anticipate those through proper planning and proper pre-flight and staying situationally aware, then we have a good chance of mitigating those threats. However, not all threats are always known to us, and sometimes we may not manage the threats correctly, and errors can occur. We've all certainly made them. I've made more than a few, and an error is something that comes from us. So when we talk about threat and error management, it's basically threats are something that are coming at us, errors are something that are coming from us. And all we're trying to do is to find a way to break the link in the accident or incident chain early on. So the better we're able to recognize a risk or a threat, the better able we are to mitigate it, to keep them from compounding. And this has application to single pilot flying. It has application to whether you're in a crew environment. It certainly has applications if you're a flight instructor.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And we talk a little bit about errors and trapping errors. And of course, a trapped error, that is the first step in breaking the link in the accident chain. So there are several examples that are in the article, which I won't go through, but the idea is if we're aware of what might happen, we're in a better position to perhaps trap an error and prevent things from getting worse. And all of this is based on the fact that there is no such thing as a perfect flight. I've said this before in other venues. There's no such thing as a perfect check ride. Perfect's the goal for most of us, but you can't attain it. But we can adopt some strategies for how to better mitigate some of the threats and reduce the errors. And those things are things like technology, for example, ADS-B, GPS. There's a variety of wonderful flight planning tools. So technology is a countermeasure to helping us, as long as it doesn't become a distraction.
I was going to say that I think that could also be a threat that leads to an error, because
absolutely,
we've certainly encountered people who, this is the communications piece, but they drop the airplane to fly the microphone.
Yes.
And there are people who might drop the airplane to operate the system. So the technology is very much a double-edged sword.
It is. Other countermeasures are the creation and use of just checklists,
yes,
and adhering to checklists, and perhaps adopting standard operating procedures. We often, hear about SOPs, in a crew environment or in a Part 135 or Part 121 environment. But general aviation can adopt SOPs about, especially if you're an owner operator of your own aircraft, about how you're going to fly it each time, every time, so that you become more reliable. Maybe when things are not going quite the way they should, you're having to deal with unanticipated weather or perhaps a maintenance problem in flight. So I encourage you to work through this. It's the first article in the series of three-letter acronyms: TEM,
yes, right,
CRM, SRM. But again, they're all about management. And all this article has done is to just take some of the concepts of a principle that has been applied in the 121 world for years and move it over to general aviation, where it has a lot of applicability.
Well, and I will say too that there's a team right now that's with some of our aviation community partners that's starting to work on revising the risk management handbook. And I happen to know that threat and error management is going to be a point of emphasis in that article, mostly because we talk about, we use CRM and SRM, which we're going to get to in a minute, to try to minimize the number of errors that are made, to stop them as much as possible. But what TEM does is to recognize, as you said at the beginning, that human beings are going to make mistakes. There's no way around that. So our goal is to try to find them, identify them, admit to them, really, and stop them before they can cause an accident or an incident. And I think that's really important. And
as a lead into the next article on CRM, many people might be asking, well, what's the difference between threat and error management, or TEM, and CRM, and how do they live together and play together? And it's really pretty clear that CRM is really about managing resources. Threat and error management is really about managing threats and risk.
And risk, yeah, exactly. And we kind of set this up to be the umbrella piece, because threat and error management is the idea that this is kind of your first and your last resort. You always want to make sure that you trap errors before they create. And there's an acronym in there that'll be familiar to people. It's UAS, but in this case, it means undesired aircraft state. So
sure.
Keep that in mind.
And an undesired aircraft state is simply an aircraft that's not in the proper position or configuration at some particular time. It could be as simple as crossing a whole short line when you haven't had a clearance. It could be 20 degrees off on your heading.
I've never done that.
No. So all we're trying to do, as we said, is to recognize these things early on so we have the best chance of stopping them.
Very good. Well, read the article. And I love the illustration that we found for it. That's pretty spectacular.
It is, for sure it is.
I hope you liked it.
I did.
Okay.
So our next article is on CRM, which I see has your name under it. So
it did. So I'm going to tell you right now that the points that are on the screen there, those are designed to match up with the quiz. So those will be helpful to you. However, I hope you'll read the article for all kinds of reasons. But one of the things that I started off with is a story, one of my favorite stories about actually an experience that I had. One of my first exposure to formal crew resource management, at least training, was when I first started with the FAA, and I got into a program that required me to go take that training. And I was not looking forward to it, because sitting through academic training is never the most fun thing in the world. And so I thought this was going to be a snooze.
And role playing has never been one of my favorite
No.
in a setting that's
No.
not in the setting I'm using it in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we ended up in one of these little groups where we got an exercise to do. And everybody got a piece of paper, and you're supposed to read the paper and then answer questions about it. So I think we all just sort of sat there quietly like we do. Everybody's got their heads down and their pencils out, and we read over the story and we start trying to answer the questions. And then you started seeing puzzled looks. And I remember looking around going, wait a minute, and I read the paper again. I don't have that piece. And it didn't take very long before we all realized that even though the piece of paper that we got, it started out the same and it looked like it was the same story, each person at the table had a piece of information that nobody else had. And that we had to work together and we had to communicate in order to answer the quiz and be released for the break we all wanted to take. So that was a very powerful lesson in what CRM is really about. And one of the points that I make in the article, when I was growing up, and I think I hope that school is changing now, but the generation that I was in, it was always do your own work. If you work with anybody else, you're cheating. But in the modern world, and particularly in the aviation world, something that we have learned very painfully is that you're only cheating yourself if you do not work with other people and you do not get all the information that you can possibly get.
Well, in fact, in our ground school classes at the airline, we tell people on day one that CRM starts in the classroom.
Yep.
It does not start in the aircraft. It actually starts in the classroom, that they need each other. And we fully expect them in some fashion to organize work groups, study groups in the evening, do whatever they need. And if we learned of some individual out of 10 people and one person wasn't with the group studying, it gave us some concern because we really felt like everybody needed to work together, and the classroom was the best place to start.
And so this is the whole idea that every person has information to offer. And obviously there is a pilot in command. Somebody has to make the ultimate decision, but the idea is that you get information. This really is about using all available resources, which is actually in the regulations. And part of your resources include other people. It might be ATC, it might be other things. But the other piece is CRM, and I think one of the points you made in some of your TEM training courses, Paul, is that CRM deals a lot with human relationships and with communication,
That's right.
Good communication. So one of the techniques that I came across, and I think you commented on it when we were talking about it earlier, is what's listed here at the bottom of the page.
The 5-step process.
Yep.
So as this is developed, you can see immediate application in a crew environment. And when I speak of crew, you can think of a traditional crew as a captain and a first officer, or a pilot and a pilot passenger, but it could also be a student and a flight instructor, for sure. So take us through the 5-step process, and then I'll have another example perhaps.
Well, you start by getting the person's attention using their name, Paul. And then the second part, state your concern. I see that we have some weather coming here. And then the third part is, what is the problem? Well, I think we're not going to be able to get through this. It looks like there's a storm. And then I think we should deviate 20 degrees. How does that sound to you?
Exactly.
So it's a structured and respectful way, but it's also designed to get results.
And I think the first couple of parts on that about getting somebody's attention by referring to them by name and stating a concern in a kind of a clear, objective way is the key to communication. The briefings that we used to do in a 121 environment, very often we would say to a new first officer, okay, we know that you don't have a lot of time in this airplane. However, if at any time during a flight there's something that you have a question about or you're not comfortable with, you need to speak up, and then we'll deal with it in a real-time fashion. And the other part that I wanted to make about this is we're typically talking about this in terms of a crew. But if you're a single pilot or in a crew environment talking to ATC, you can have that same kind of conversation with air traffic control.
Oh, yes.
I think I told you earlier about an example. We had one of our crews just operating a revenue flight, and there was a pretty well-developed storm ahead of them, and they said to ATC, we need 20 left. And the controller said, unable. And our pilot said, well, then we need 20 right. And the controller said, unable. So then the pilot said, well, we're not able to go through this storm. And the response from ATC was, well, sir, if you need to deviate, you're going to have to declare an emergency. He said, okay, we'll declare an emergency. And then they deviated as they needed. So this is sort of an extreme example, but it's about, remember that air traffic control should really be thought of as air traffic facilitators.
Yeah.
Work with them, communicate with them, use CRM, and life will be better.
Well, I remember using this kind of technique, and I think it was before I understood that it was a formal one with ATC several years ago, actually heading over New Mexico and going into potential icing conditions. And I'd worked out I could do this, this, or this. So when we actually started to collect ice, I went to ATC and said, okay, we're collecting ice. We need to do something. We can do this, that, or that, but we can't stay where we are. Which would you prefer? And the controller came right back with a favored option, and that's what we did. Sure. And then we kept, actually, he kept asking, how you doing? How's it going? Are you okay? So this is, the CRM is about, it's about being assertive in a civil and appropriate way.
Absolutely.
But making sure that concerns do not simply go unaddressed.
That's right. So this is a good move into our next article, which I like the title of, You Never Roam Alone. And it's certainly about single pilot resource management. And the point is stressed throughout that even if you are in a light sport aircraft in an untowered airport and you avoid controlled airspace, you're still not alone.
No, and your resources are people that you're talking to as well as people you're not talking to. Now, the story that I tell in here is one that I use a lot in safety seminars. It was a time when I needed my own version of threat and error management because I ended up departing into weather that I just didn't know any better. I was a little bit too optimistic, and the weather was, let's just say that it didn't do what it was supposed to do, which weather has a way of doing. And I'm alone in the airplane, and I needed to, I knew that I was going to have to make an approach and landing at an airport I'd never landed at before. But part of what I was doing was listening to what other people were doing, figuring out what was going on. I certainly used air traffic control, but there are all sorts of things. And one of the points that I made in here is, yeah, it came out okay because clearly I'm here. I didn't bend anything. I didn't hurt anything. But I could have done it so much better if I had used the sort of structured approach that we talk about here and some of the ideas in the risk management handbook. Just really looking at what are the resources, what are my options, and how could I have done this better?
Well, and I think it's also important to remember that when we talk about SRM, single pilot resource management, it's not just what we do when we're doing a pre-flight or in the flight or after the flight. There are other things that will enhance our skill sets, like viewing this webinar, going to class, participating in wings. All of these will help build our internal database that will help drive our decisions. Absolutely.
So, and they all work together. The single pilot resource management is it's a weird acronym. It's always bugged me a little bit because I think I even put in the article that it's an awkward and not quite right acronym, but it has become what it is. So we have single pilot resource management. The fact that you are alone doesn't mean that you can't use the techniques of CRM like we talked about, and TEM applies to everything. And these are not, obviously they're acronyms, they all have the word management in there, but they all are concepts that have been developed, worked out over the years. Some, in fact, I think most of them probably did originate in the 121 airline world, but that doesn't mean that we can't and that we shouldn't take the best of the best and bring it into general aviation. Welcome back to general aviation, by the way.
Thanks.
You're welcome. I know you still stayed into it, but now you're going to be like the rest of us and do your own flight planning.
I know. I'm kind of, I think the next time somebody says go fly on the flight plan, I'll just squawk 7,700 because it's been so long since I've done that. But
I'll teach you.
Okay.
I'll help you. You can use CRM. I'll help you.
I could. Let's have a look at the information age.
Absolutely.
And as a preface to this, in the digital world that we live in, I mean, we can't escape it. I mean, you're never really, we're tracked. I mean, you're never really alone. And if you don't believe that, look at FlightAware, listen to Live ATC. Everybody's watching, and we have an exceptional amount of data. And just because we have data does not necessarily mean we have information. So the data needs to be applied in context, and the information that is discussed in this article by Mr. Williams is really important because it talks about all of the available resources and data that have amassed through a program called ASIAS, which components of that and the principles of it can also be applied in general aviation. So tell us how that works.
Well, this article talks about, and by the way, I really like the way it started out with the difference between data and information, and that information is data put in the context that's actually useful to you. Yeah, there are a couple of they're unwieldy acronyms here. I certainly understand that, but there are databases that have been established to start collecting information about general aviation, and it's all de-identified. And I want to make the point, one of the points that's also in the article, that the compliance program and the FAA and the whole approach we're taking is that open, transparent, learn from your mistakes, learn from other people's mistakes. Enforcement is a tool that is reserved only for those who are unwilling or unable to comply with the rules and with risk management practices and everything else. So this is not a Big Brother is watching. This is about information being used in the aggregate to try to make sure that we see patterns, we see trends, we can address things that come up. And it's about giving back too. I know when we did our previous article about the NASA reports, the aviation safety reporting system, one of the things that I subscribe to is the NASA callback, which is that is the result of this information. They pull together stories and information and tell you, hey, here's what somebody else did, here's what somebody found. Don't make the same mistake.
And another part of what I would call, these are voluntary safety programs to some extent. Another part of this is we often apply them to, well, I'll fill out a NASA form or a NASA report for something I did.
I've done that too.
However, it can also be used to report something that you think might be a safety issue.
Absolutely.
For example, you might be taxiing at an airport and realize that the airport signage might be ambiguous or confusing or not consistent with what you see on an airport diagram. And those can also be identified because once they get into the system, they have a better chance of being dealt with. So it's not about things that we do as pilots. It could also be things that we see are potential safety information.
And I filed a couple of reports about that as well. There's no limit to how many you can file, and you don't have to have made a mistake, as Paul just said, you do not have to have made a mistake to file a report or to contribute to the system. One of Paul was talking earlier about don't waste a mistake, never waste a mistake, and that's a great phrase, but one that goes along with it and that goes along with learning from your mistakes and from the ones that others have made before you. When I was in college, I had a French professor who made us write a composition every week, and we had to turn in 2 copies, and she kept one. And the rule was that if we had covered a grammar point in class, or if we had made the mistake before and it had been corrected, it was an automatic letter grade off. So it was pretty harsh. And I remember somebody saying, well, Dr. Sherman, why do you do it that way? And why does it have to be that way? And she said in this way that only a French woman could, there's so many mistakes you have never made for the first time. I cannot possibly allow you to repeat any. So I always thought that that was a good way to think about. There are other people who've made mistakes, so why not? Don't repeat the ones that other people have made. Go find your own.
Indeed.
And I have.
Sure, we all have. The next column is your column on checklist, which is you've taken kind of a pun here about on course.
I did.
For safety, and have reviewed some good resources.
Yeah, there have been a lot of fresh content on FAA safety.gov recently. One of the courses on there is one of yours, actually, the threat and error management. That so courses that have been done for the NAFI Pilot Development Center
program.
Those are on there, and as we've already talked about, now you have you have access to courses that were made from this broadcast. So if you haven't taken previous ones or you want to get wings credit for something, then there are plenty of those. But these are a few of the courses that I identified that are consistent with the theme of this particular issue of the magazine. And they're certainly worth taking with or without wings credit, but of course everybody is looking for that.
Sure.
We understand that. It's a great incentive.
And if you look at the titles, look at the common theme. The first one about this aeronautical decision making, the next one about decision making for pilots, skipping down a little bit, distraction management was one that was put on by a NAFI. And then the last one, as you said, adapting threat and area management to general aviation. So it's decision making and management go hand in hand.
They do. And I think I mentioned in here that there were a couple of courses that were listed that might have been for sort of for maintenance, but the fact that it might be a maintenance course doesn't mean that you couldn't learn a lot from it. And we do try to make sure that on safety.gov that we are providing material that is not just for pilots, but for mechanics and anybody else who is interested in aviation safety. So.
Sure. Another column, which we always get some attention to, is about drones.
Yes.
And of course, this is a fast growing part of the industry, which I'm sure the FAA is devoting a lot of time and resources to. But it was interesting. I had never really thought about the concepts that was developed in this article until I read it, but it's talking about CRM for drones.
I had not thought about it until I read it either.
But if you think about the use of drones, particularly in this article, it could be about a crime scene or a critical incident or some sort of a critical event that requires aerial surveillance. You have to apply CRM, and also I would put a plug in for threat and error management, because you might be dealing with distractions, weather, people, personnel, other agencies, in addition to managing the flight path of your drone.
Yeah, I think that sometimes I'm guilty of thinking that a remote pilot is pilot plus device. Or that when we talk about drones, I'm still actually a little bit uncomfortable with the acronym that has been used, unmanned aircraft systems, because it's just so wrong. The truth is, the term that I think is used in the Air Force increasingly, remotely piloted aircraft, is much more accurate. And it's one of the reasons that for the airman certification standards for remote pilots, we've adopted that term. It's the remote pilot certificate, not the UAS certificate. And the remote pilot piece, that too has some layers to it, because you might think that it's just one person, but I think one of the points that this article brings out really well is that a UAS, an unmanned aircraft system, or a drone, often involves not just the remote pilot, but observers, and everybody has a function, and those functions might be different, but they certainly need to be coordinated.
Absolutely.
And the article also makes the point that you need to, well, like everything else, you need to practice, and you need realistic practice, not just something that is a set piece, but go practice in the environment that you'll actually be using this in, to make sure that the communication and coordination is all nailed down the way that it should be.
Well, and as an offshoot of this, think about balloon pilots and the coordination that they need to have when they're working with their ground crew. I mean, it's absolutely essential. So even though that part of the operation is not in the balloon itself, they're absolutely key to recovery, and there has to be a great deal of coordination.
Well, and in a funny way, I think that's something that the remote pilot community, the balloon community, as you just pointed out, but also the glider community.
Sure.
These are all parts of aviation where their normal operating procedures may have called for more use of CRM, TEM, and SRM, frankly, than some of the flying that I've typically done.
They've perhaps been practicing it longer than
we have.
Yes.
Yes. That's what I'm saying.
Yes.
So.
Okay.
Anyway, but it was an interesting piece, and every time I see one of the drone debrief pieces, I learn a little bit more about the remote pilot community. And let me just do a little aside here. One of the reasons that we include this, that we put this column in now, is that the whole goal is to integrate remote pilots and the remote drones into the airspace system along with everybody else, and we need to learn about each other. We can't view each other as separate or parallel. We have to work and play and fly together, and we need to do it. So we need better CRM with the remote pilot community.
For sure.
And we need to be working on that, all of us.
Our next article which covers the maintenance aspect is all about ADS-B installation. And although it's written with the installer in mind about having to verify and determine the appropriate performance of the ADS-B installation by doing what's called a paper, which is another acronym, which is a way of verifying that the requirements of the installation have been met. It's also not only possible, but it should be common procedure that an owner-operator after the installation can also go through this process as well. So how do they do that?
Well, there's the article has some information about where to go to do it. I hope that most people who are watching this broadcast have by now equipped with ADS-B, either have equipped or getting close, because there's not very much longer. In fact, by the time the next issue of the magazine comes out, the ADS-B is absolutely required.
Yes.
So one of the things that you can do, and probably should do on a regular basis, just to make sure that everything is working the way that it's supposed to, is go run this report. It's free. It takes about 15 minutes to get the results. You can do it as often as you like. I know that with my flying club in Virginia, we installed ADS-B several years ago, but we've been running these reports periodically. And we did discover not too long ago, we had a little bit of a glitch, and it turned out to be kind of a combination of equipment error and also some settings that we needed to fix. So we did that, we took care of it, and we were done. Well,
and again, going through this process is another way of mitigating risk and preventing errors. So if you can identify something early on and deal with it either at the installation or post-installation, then you're well on your way to understanding what many of the concepts in this issue are about.
Yep. And the ADS-B is, I think we can think about ADS-B, particularly if you have ADS-B in some form, either certified or non-certified, that this is another form of the crew resource management, threat and error management, all of these things. I know we were visiting with pilot friends over the weekend, and one of the comments they made, because they'd just flown into a fairly busy airport here in Arizona, was that it got a little bit closer and the ADS-B suddenly turned into a beehive of airplanes headed into the same place. And while that is really good information, it also leads to a point that I think is important. We made it earlier, but part of your threat and error management and CRM and SRM, all of these things, one important component of that is knowing how to manage the technology that you have on board.
Absolutely.
And not be distracted in a harmful way from what you need to be focused on.
Distraction happens to be the next topic of discussion in the column, and it's essentially
how that happens.
Yeah, it's essentially discussing about how to manage passengers, also about something very simple, which is cell phone and personal entertainment devices. And I think this is huge because all of us are surrounded by this type of technology, and we're consumed with it. And although it can provide some benefits to us, especially if you're using your handheld device to maybe look at radar before departure. Many people have apps on their phone which are certainly capable of that. It then cannot become a social media distraction. And your colleague Tom Hoffman talks about, you know, some notable accidents that have occurred because of distractions due to this type of technology. And I'd go on to say that in the 121 world, I know of several operators that actually have a checklist item on, for example, their before start checklist that says cell phones, PEDs off, or airplane mode or something, just as a simple reminder that turn them off, don't let them become a distraction.
Yeah, well, it's a funny thing that people seem to believe that if the phone rings, you have to answer it. If a text comes in, you have to deal with it. And that is certainly true for driving. For flying, one would hope that you may have it in a place where it's either turned off into do not disturb mode, or you would just not be able to hear it at all. But now the way things come through Bluetooth into a headset, you probably will. I love the title, Don't Bother Me, I'm Flying.
Yes.
It's kind of that says it all. But I did think, how many accidents have we heard about or seen where the last pictures, or we may have heard about it, hopefully not seen too much of it, but the last pictures that came out were right before the crash. The pilot or somebody was taking pictures that maybe were a distraction from what they really should have been doing.
And I think too that this is just a simple note for those of us that, you know, enjoy taking passengers and having friends with us in the airplane. We need to do due diligence and brief them on our expectations. There's a note there that there is no sterile cockpit policy for Part 91, but there can be. You can make your own policy to say, you know, from this point until we get to a certain altitude, or until I tell you, I appreciate a quiet environment.
Well, and that's part of the one of the things that we've talked about in previous issues of the magazine and previous broadcasts is what I call the safety checklist for briefing passengers: seatbelts, air and cooling, fire, exit and emergency, traffic and talking, and your questions. But the traffic and talking part, we didn't actually put in anything there for cell phones or selfies, and I don't think we need to, but it can go into the traffic and talking.
No, but this article is a great reminder of just something as innocent that a cell phone could end up being a distraction.
I don't think cell phones are very innocent.
Maybe they're not innocent anymore now.
But nice try.
Yeah. For our helicopter colleagues, this is a article that kind of picks up where a previous one left off in terms of type clubs. And there's type clubs for any and many types of flying. Bonanza type clubs, Cessna, tail draggers, certain parts of the country. And the same thing applies to helicopters as well.
Yeah, this is just the points that you see under key points are just a few of the organizations that are listed in the article. And the whole type club concept is, again, that too aligns very much with our CRM, SRM, because these are ways that we can learn we can learn from each other. I know that the folks, I mean, this is on the airplane side, but there are members of my flying club who are in the Cessna Pilots Association, and we learn all sorts of things about not just the airplane, but about flying through that. And these are all resources that are available to the rotorcraft community as part of.
Absolutely.
And I think the title of this one is a take on the TV
Cheers.
series. Yes, indeed, where everybody knows your name.
That's
right. Great.
Your next article is one of my favorites.
I knew it would be.
Because, as you know, I am a Star Trek fan, but only a fan of the original
I'm working on
Star
that.
Trek.
I need
So,
to get you into Jean-Luc Picard.
I'm just a fan of the original Star Trek, which was, of course, popular in the mid '60s, and for me, it's still popular.
Of course.
But one of the characteristics of Star Trek, of all varieties, has been the diversity of crews and experiences. And you have an expression here: infinite diversity and infinite combinations.
That was I'm sure you recognize that as a
Yes.
phrase from Spock. It was
Yes.
part of the Vulcan idea. And by the way, peace, live long and prosper. So I like the idea that Star Trek was one of the early, it was a series that was ahead of its time.
Indeed.
In a lot of ways, not just the technology, although I have to laugh sometimes when I see the communicators they have now, because
Yes.
our cell phones are far better.
Yes.
However, the idea, they were already trying to promote the diversity of a crew, and the crew all work together. And
Exactly.
I also talk about in this article the idea that most groups go through this progression of forming, storming, norming, and performing.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there's some storming that goes on in Star Trek, otherwise there wouldn't be much drama. However, one of the things that I think is very important is that flight crews, they skip the storming part. They can't do that.
Right.
And
Although some have tried. But
some have
yeah.
tried, but
Sure.
yeah, I've heard some stories from you. But I've always been very interested in the fact that flight crews meet maybe for the first time an hour or so before the flight,
Or less.
or
Sure.
less, and everybody knows, thanks to standard operating procedures, exactly what to do and what to expect from the other people, and exactly how they're going to work. So they skip storming, go from forming to norming and performing, because they use the SOPs as the norms. And at the time that I was writing this article, as you see on the screen there, Captain Al Haynes, United 232, had just passed away. And I had the privilege of hearing him speak twice. And both times, every pilot in the room was rapt, and we all gave him a standing ovation at the end, because, but he talked very much about how important it is that diverse crew members could come together for the first time. And I think his crew was all they were new.
Sure.
And the guy who came up to the flight deck to help out he didn't know any of them either. But because of the standard operating procedures, this infinite diversity, infinite combinations, they were able to come together and work well together.
And like the line out of Apollo 13, let's work the problem.
Yeah. Let's not make it any worse. Let's work the problem. So, and while the crew member business is not applicable to everybody in general aviation, I think what we've tried to really stress in this issue is that there are so many concepts from that world that have been adapted, can be adapted, and used to enhance safety in general aviation. So as I put at the end there, as an airline passenger, because I fly a lot, I'm certainly grateful for the developments that have contributed to greater safety. And as a general aviation pilot and instructor, I'm hugely grateful that we have these techniques now that we can all use. I've read quite a few books. I think I even referenced one in here called Sky Gods, about how it used to be gear up and shut up. I'll talk to you when I want to, but we've come a long way. And
Indeed.
Thank
Absolutely.
heavens for that.
And key to this whole concept too is about any kind of crew interaction is proper briefings and expectations. And a phrase I've often used is you want to have a shared mental model of how things are going to go.
Yeah. But before we go, I am going to work on you with the next generation.
Good luck. So one of your crew, this is FAA Faces, Sabrina Woods. We've actually had Sabrina as a guest on FAA Safety Briefing Live some time ago, and she's featured in this article on FAA Faces. Yeah,
Sabrina is, as Paul mentioned here, she was a member of our staff, and she moved on to another job. We told her that we would let her move to another position only if she agreed to come back periodically and write for us, which she has done. We had to twist her arm a little bit to get her to be the FAA Faces person for this issue, but she agreed. And one of the reasons it was perfect is not just her connection to the magazine, but the passion that Sabrina has developed over the years, and what led her to move to another position is her passion for human factors.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that fits in with our threat and error management, CRM, SRM focus. She's really looking at what are things that can be done in human factors terms to prevent accidents and incidents
Mm-hmm.
from hurting people. And she's got some very powerful reasons that motivated her to do that.
And she's had a very good career and has made many contributions. So I can see why she's featured here.
Yeah, well, if you have missed out before, I think you'll see a reference to this in the key points, but there's a little bit more in the article. Sabrina was an accident investigator during her Air Force career, and she was just horrified when accidents were written off as pilot error, but nobody knew and nobody was willing to dive in and figure out what exactly that meant.
Mm-hmm.
So she's kind of trying to make it her life's work to contribute to solving that problem.
Good for her. Our next two are our parts about medical, the Air Medical Advisory from the Federal Surgeon, Mike Berry, about cancer and cardiovascular disease. And the part that I learned out of this and appreciate is that with many of the advances, what used to be a no-go for a medical mm-hmm. is now possible with proper guidance, proper treatment, and following up, with an AME and your physicians.
Well, that's about working together to manage your health.
Mm-hmm.
There were some things that I learned here too, that some of the reasons behind some of the medical prohibitions, the fact that with cancer treatment, for example, it's sudden and unexpected incapacitation
yes.
that
mm-hmm.
they're concerned about. And speaking of advances, one of the things I'm sure we'll have in the future, there's some changes to the protocols for diabetes. So
that's right.
It's been in the news recently.
That's on the forefront, yes.
So I'm pretty sure we'll probably be seeing that in the future issue of the magazine.
Yes. And next one on condition inspection. I mean, this is something that's common for everybody, and that's the common cold.
Especially this time of the year.
All of us have at one time or another wrestled with the decision, do I feel well enough to go? I think my cold is over. I feel better. I can breathe. And then we're in flight and we realize that we're not feeling as good as we thought we would. And there's a lot of good information in this one as well about medications.
Well, it talks about why it is that maybe you don't feel so good once you're in flight, because the cold is some of the things that colds do to you really can be even more adversely affected by the atmospheric changes. And so I think the advice it gives, if you don't feel well enough to fly without medication, maybe you don't feel well enough
That's
to fly.
Right. And there was a bulleted point there about the effects of the medication are sometimes worse than the symptoms you're trying to treat.
They can be.
So just because something is over the counter doesn't necessarily mean it's appropriate, and we need to exercise some judgment in our use and application of those. And the article gives some examples of how mm-hmm. long to wait mm-hmm. After you feel like you're okay, and if you've had some side effects, go through several dosing cycles before you say, okay, I'm okay.
And because we're already working on the next issue, I can give you a hint. There'll be some more material on medication use in the next issue of the magazine. So
okay,
keep a lookout.
One of our final things as we start to wrap up is the ATIS column, which is the Aviation News Roundup. Wildlife strike reporting. It's more than just bird strikes, of course.
Absolutely.
The weather cam program, I had no idea what that was, but it's especially important to aviators in Canada and Alaska. And what about CARES?
The Civil Aviation Registry initiative. The registry has been stuck with a lot of paper products for a long time, and there's an effort to modernize and digitize. And if you are looking for more information about it, there are a couple of links there that you can follow, and the blurb in here gives you some information about what the program is trying to do. So take a look.
Very good. And there is a email address that I think if people have questions,
they can
include that and address it. And then for feedback,
We have an
this is-
email address too.
This is something that I think is a standard part of the magazine, and you truly are interested in getting feedback about these issues. So what's the best way to do it?
Well, you got several options there. You can follow us on social media. You can send us an email. You can send us a snail mail. But I don't think we get very many of those any longer. But we certainly do try to respond. If somebody requests that their information not be published or their letter not be published, then we don't use it. But we try to use this as an opportunity to let other people know what people are thinking, and for us to get ideas and to hear what people are looking for or not. So appreciate the feedback we get.
So you can see it, safety briefing at FAA.gov. We'll get you there, and as Susan said, some of them may be published that are
Right.
Interesting of feedback. Also, where to find us?
Well, you have a lot of options. This is our usual piece. We've got the web page. We've got archived content. You can download it. You can pick up copies for free. You can subscribe via GPO. So there are lots and lots of ways to get the magazine. Pick one, pick more than one, and hopefully you will learn something from the things that we're trying to put out.
Well, and I'd also like to make a shout out to your social media individual, Paul Cianciola, who does a marvelous job at social media.
Indeed.
And that's an important mechanism of this as well. Our next one is January and February.
It is Know Your Aircraft. We're going to be looking at the different parts of the airplane, and I think you're going to learn a lot. I thought I knew about parts of airplanes, but I learned a few things in the process of editing it.
Very good. That's great. So, Susan, once again, it's been nice to work with you this evening, and we'll look forward to the next time.
Well, I'm not sure where we'll be, but
Don't
I
know.
can tell you that in January, I can guarantee that Phoenix will have nicer weather than Wisconsin.
Guaranteed.
So wherever you happen to be, fly safe, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Take care.